"You're going to sleep with us," said the three giant women already living on the farm. He bought. The farm was a forgotten corner of the territory, a place that reeked of solitude, desperation, and a fragile, unearned peace. Arthur traced the weathered grain of the cabin door. His hands, better suited for ink and ledgers than splintered wood, trembled slightly. He'd paid for silence, a final resting place for his ghosts. The shrieking of canister shot from the war still echoed in his quietest moments, a phantom limb he could never shed. He was no greenhorn. He knew the feel of a place. And this place, it was watching him. He thought he'd bought solitude, but he'd inherited secrets. Then the door groaned open. Before him stood a woman taller than any man he'd ever seen, flanked by two more just like her. Her voice was low, like grinding stone, and it shattered his fragile world. "This is our home now," she said, her eyes pinning him in place. "You're going to sleep with us." The barn was his kingdom now. A kingdom of dust motes dancing in slivers of moonlight, of the warm, earthy scent of hay and livestock. It was a world away from the main house, a fortress of feminine power he dared not breach. Arthur lay on a pile of straw, the deed to this land a useless, crinkling thing in his pocket. The woman's words echoed a promise and a threat that had exiled him here. "You're going to sleep with us." It was a lie. He was sleeping with the cows. He woke not to the gentle kiss of dawn, but to the shudder of the very earth. Peering through a crack in the barn wall, he saw them. It wasn't work. It was a force of nature. Ingrid, the middle sister, stood before a massive oak stump that would have taken two men a full day to conquer. She swung a maul that looked like a child's toy in her grip, and with a sound like a rifle shot the stump split clean in two. Helga, the leader, was in the near field, a hand plow strapped to her shoulders, carving furrows into the hard-packed earth with the slow, inexorable power of a glacier. They were leviathans. Beautiful and terrifying. He, a man of paper and quiet grief, felt like a field mouse watching titans reshape the world. Later that morning, clutching his deed like a holy relic, he approached Helga. Her face was granite, her eyes the pale cold blue of a winter sky. This document, Arthur started, his voice feeling thin in the vast, open air. "It says this land is mine." Helga didn't even glance at the paper. She wiped a sheen of sweat from her brow with a forearm nearly the size of his thigh. "Paper is patient. It will hold any lie you write on it." "It's the law," he insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. She finally turned to him, her shadow swallowing him whole. "The law is 1,000 miles away, little man. Here, the law is this." She slammed a calloused palm onto the wooden plow, the impact a solid final thud. "It is the rain, the sun, and the hands that pull life from the dirt. You have a claim to the dirt. We are the life. Now get out of my field before you get planted." He retreated, his pride in tatters. For days this was the rhythm. He was a ghost on his own land, watching them perform feats of impossible labor. He was ignored, a useless ornament. The isolation he had craved was now a suffocating punishment. Then the water pump broke. He watched for an entire afternoon as Ingrid and Helga fought it. They tried to force the handle, their immense strength bending the iron, but achieving nothing. Their frustration was a palpable storm cloud. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Arthur crept from the barn. He carried a small pouch of tools he'd kept from his past life. He understood machines, the quiet logic of levers and gears. He saw it almost immediately, a small sheared pin, a piece no bigger than his thumb. With trembling, ink-stained fingers, he fashioned a replacement from a spare nail and a bit of wire. He worked by moonlight, the metallic clicks and scrapes loud in the stillness. When he was done, he stepped back, took a breath, and pushed the handle. A beautiful, miraculous squeak, followed by the gurgle of water spilling into the trough. He didn't see the shadow detach from the porch of the house until it was nearly upon him. It was Ingrid. She stared at the flowing water, then at him. Her face, usually a stoic mask, held a flicker of something he couldn't name. She gave a single curt nod, then turned and walked back to the house without a word. It was more than he had gotten from them in a week. It was a beginning. Later, huddled in the barn's cool darkness, he saw a shape approach the door. He held his breath. Freya, the youngest and quietest of the sisters, knelt down. She placed a wooden bowl on the ground, the steam rising from it carrying the scent of rabbit stew and herbs. She looked toward him, a brief, shy glance before retreating back into the night. Arthur stared at the offering. It was more than food. It was a truce. He ate the warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stew. He was no longer just an intruder. But as he settled back into the hay, a new question haunted him, more unsettling than their threats. If they were this strong, this capable, what in God's name were they so afraid of the truce held for 2 weeks? A fragile, unspoken thing, it lived in the spaces between them. It was in the bowl of stew Freya left for him each night, in the clean water from the pump he had fixed, in the single grudging nod Ingrid gave him when he cleverly rehung a heavy barn door that had come off its hinges. Arthur found a new rhythm, not of solitude, but of quiet observation. He was an island, but he could feel the currents of their world eddying around him. He learned the language of their movements, the fierce protective energy of Helga, the stoic, tireless strength of Ingrid, the gentle, quiet grace of Freya. He started sketching them in a small leather-bound book he carried. Not their faces, but their forms, as they worked like mythical figures, moving against the vast, empty canvas of the prairie. He was sketching Ingrid as she hoisted a fallen cottonwood trunk onto her shoulder, a sight that still defied all logic when he saw the dust on the horizon. It was not a lone rider. It was 3. They moved with a purpose that was not friendly, their silhouettes sharp and predatory against the afternoon sun. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The world was coming to their door. Arthur stood near the porch as they rode in his heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. The man in the lead was wiry and dressed in black, a cruel smile playing on his thin lips. He and his men reined in their horses, their eyes sweeping over the farm with a dismissive air, their gaze sliding right over Arthur as if he were part of the fence. The man in black dismounted his spurs, jingling a cold, metallic tune. He ignored the house and the massive woman now standing silently in its doorway and walked directly to Arthur. "You the fellow who bought this scrap of dirt?" The man asked, his voice oily. "My name is Arthur. I own this land." The words felt hollow, even as he said them. "Right. Well, I'm Fletcher. I represent Mr. Bartholomew Thorne," he said, as if the name itself were a weapon. "Mr. Thorne is consolidating his holdings in this valley. He's authorized me to offer you a generous price to save you the trouble of failing out here on your own." The offer was an insult, a threat wrapped in the guise of business. "The farm is not for sale," Arthur said, his voice steadier than he felt. Fletcher's smile vanished. That wasn't a request. He took a step closer, his men shifting in their saddles, their hands moving casually toward their hips. "Mr. Thorne doesn't like complications. And this farm with its creek, it's a complication. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." A floorboard creaked on the porch. Helga had moved to the edge of the steps. She hadn't said a word, but her presence changed the very quality of the air, making it heavy-charged. Fletcher finally acknowledged her with a sneer. "Quite a specimen you got here," he said to Arthur. "Thorne might pay extra for the livestock." The ground seemed to tremble. From either side of the house, Ingrid and Freya appeared. They moved in perfect silent unison, flanking their older sister. They were a wall of muscle and bone and cold, silent fury. 3 goddesses of wrath descended to earth. Fletcher and his men for the first time looked unsettled. Their casual menace evaporated, replaced by a flicker of primal fear. "You are trespassing." Helga's voice was not loud. It was a low, guttural rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep in the earth. Fletcher tried to recover his swagger. Now hold on, ladies. He never finished. Ingrid took one step forward, reached down, and gripped the top of a thick cedar fence post. With the sound of splintering wood and protesting earth, she pulled it straight out of the ground. She held it in one hand, balanced like a walking stick. Silence. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in power. Fletcher's face had gone pale. His men stared, their hands frozen, their bravado gone. A gun was useless against an earthquake. I believe Helga said, her cold eyes never leaving Fletcher, you were leaving. Fletcher swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing. He took a slow step back, then another, before turning and mounting his horse in a single panicked movement. He gathered his reins, his face a mask of humiliated rage. This ain't over, he spat. Thorn gets what he wants. Always. They hightailed it out of the yard, leaving a cloud of dust and a ringing, profound silence in their wake. Arthur looked at the three women. He saw the fierce unity, the absolute, unyielding defense of their home. He finally understood. Their size wasn't a curse. It was their shield. And he was standing behind it with them. The fear he'd felt was gone, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar surge of anger. His fight was now their fight. That night he didn't sketch. He retreated to the barn, lit a lantern, and unrolled the deed and his surveyor's maps. His mind the only weapon he had raced over the lines and legal jargon. Thorn didn't just want the land. Fletcher had said it. This farm with its creek. His finger traced the blue line of the creek as it snaked through their property. It was the only water source in the entire sector that didn't dry up by late summer. And then he saw it. A small, almost illegible note in the margin of the original survey from 50 years ago. A forgotten covenant, an unbreakable water right. Thorn couldn't just take the land. He would have to erase it, and everyone on it. Arthur stared at the map, the lantern light flickering in his eyes. The easy part was over. Now the war would begin. The quiet that followed was a different kind of silence. Not the peace Arthur had sought, but the held breath before a storm. He showed Helga the map, his finger tracing the surveyor's faded note on their water rights. She studied it, her brow furrowed. Paper shields are easily burned, she'd grumbled, but he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. It was a weapon she could not wield, but one she now knew they possessed. The first blow came not with a gunshot, but with the scent of death on the morning air. Arthur was woken by a cry from Freya, a sound of pure anguish. He ran from the barn to the creek bed. The water, once so clear and full of life, ran sluggish and black, coated in a greasy, foul-smelling film. Upstream, Thorn's men had dumped the bloated carcasses of a half-dozen sheep, poisoning their lifeblood. Rage, cold and sharp, pierced Arthur's heart. This was not a fight for land. It was a war of annihilation. The spring, he yelled, his voice cutting through their stunned horror. The High Meadow Spring. We can dig a diversion trench. What would have taken a dozen men a week, the sisters accomplished in a day. Arthur, using the principles of geometry he'd learned from books, staked out the most efficient path. Then he could only watch in awe as Helga and Ingrid became human excavators, their shovels moving like extensions of their own bodies, tearing through rock and soil. Freya, with surprising strength, hauled away boulders that Arthur couldn't even budget. He was the mind. They were the unstoppable force. By nightfall, a trickle of clean water flowed to their troughs. They had won the first battle, but they were exhausted, and the Black Creek remained a scar on their land, a promise of what was to come. The second blow came with fire. A dry wind kicked up, 3 nights later, a hot, whispering devil. It carried the smell of smoke. On the western ridge, a line of orange gnawed at the black sky, eating its way toward their dry fields. a fire line deliberately set. "We have to cut a break," Arthur shouted over the wind's howl. He remembered this from the war, the desperate scorched earth defense against an all-consuming enemy. The night became a living hell, a frantic dance against a roaring beast of flame. The air was thick with soot, and the heat was a physical blow. Arthur, his small frame buffeted by the wind, ran ahead, marking a wide arc in the dirt, a desperate gamble to starve the fire. And the sisters fought. They moved through the smoke and embers like Valkyries, their faces grim, their movements precise and powerful. They swung wet horse blankets with enough force to smother whole sections of flame. They used their shovels not to dig, but to throw massive clouds of dirt that choked the fire's advance. For the first time, Arthur saw fear in their eyes. Not for themselves, but for the home they had carved from this wilderness. He saw the terror in Helga's face as a gust of wind sent a shower of sparks toward the barn. He saw the raw panic and fought it down with cold logic. The wind is shifting north. "We can trap it against the rocks," he screamed, his throat raw. They followed his lead without question. They trusted his mind as he trusted their strength. Together they battled the inferno for hours, a tiny, defiant family against a sea of fire. As the dawn broke gray and smoky, the fire was out. A wide black scar separated their farm from the burned prairie. They had held. They collapsed near the porch bodies, aching faces and clothes black with soot. Freya gently tended to a burn on Arthur's arm, her large hands surprisingly tender. Helga stood, staring at the blackened earth, her broad shoulders slumped. "He will not stop." Her voice was heavy with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. Arthur stood beside her, the smell of ash filling his lungs. He was no longer the frightened man who had hidden in the barn. He was part of this. He was a defender of this sanctuary. "No," he said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "He won't." He looked from the poisoned creek to the scorched earth. He looked at the weary faces of the three women who had fought beside him. They were a fortress, but a fortress under siege cannot last forever. A chilling clarity settled over him. Defense was a slow death. That night the maps were spread on the cabin floor, the lantern light casting their four shadows long and distorted against the walls. Arthur's finger was steady as it jabbed at a point miles away. A sprawling ranch marked with a single name, Thorn. "He keeps attacking our home because he thinks his is untouchable," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's wrong." Helga looked up, her eyes narrowing, a dangerous fire rekindling in their depths. "What are you saying, little man?" "I'm saying," Arthur replied. Meeting her gaze, "the siege is over. Now we fight back." The plan felt like madness when he spoke it aloud in the flickering lamplight of the cabin. It was a scholar's strategy, a gamble of physics and chemistry against a dozen armed men. He spoke of choke points, of repurposed blasting powders stolen from a nearby quarry, of the simple, brutal truth that a panicked horse was a more effective weapon than a frightened man. Freya's eyes were wide with fear. Ingrid's were unreadable stone. It was Helga, her jaw set, who gave the final verdict. "You are a strange little man, Arthur," she'd said, a grim smile touching her lips. "Let's go build your trap." They worked through the night, a silent, determined team. The sisters' strength moved the earth, bearing the charges Arthur carefully set in the narrow defile that served as the only approach to their farmstead. He was no soldier, but he knew the anatomy of a battlefield. They came at dawn. A dozen riders with Thorn himself at their head, a black-clad king leading his army. They flowed into the valley, confident and arrogant, expecting to crush a small pocket of resistance. Arthur watched from a high window in the barn, his stomach a cold, tight knot. Beside him, Ingrid held a blacksmith's hammer, its weight resting comfortably on her shoulder. Below, Helga and Freya were shadows behind the stone corral, armed with little more than pitchforks and fury. The first shots echoed, cracking the morning's peace. Splinters flew from the cabin walls. Thorn's men were flushing them out, their laughter carrying on the wind. Then the sisters moved. It was not a battle. It was a force of nature unleashed. Freya, with a roar that seemed to shake the mountains, used a massive fence log as a battering ram, sweeping 2 riders from their saddles. Ingrid was a whirlwind of iron, the blacksmith's hammer, a blur in her hands, crushing rifles and bone with terrifying impartiality. They were chaos and power, and they held the line. But they were only 2. Thorn's men spread out their rifles, finding range. The air filled with the whistle of lead. Bullets chipped at the stones where the sisters took cover. They were being pinned down. Arthur knew it was time. He had to give the signal. He leaned out the hayloft door, raising a small red flag. Thorn saw him. The Baron's face twisted in a sneer of recognition. The brain of the operation. He raised his own rifle, taking careful aim not at the giants in the yard, but at the small, crucial man in the barn. Arthur saw the muzzle flash. Time seemed to bend. A scream, his name tore from Freya's throat. A mountain of blonde hair and fierce loyalty moved with impossible speed. Helga threw herself in front of the hayloft, her body shielding him. He heard the wet, ugly thud of the bullet hitting flesh. He saw her stagger, a dark stain blossoming on her shoulder. She grunted in pain but did not fall. She glared toward Thorn, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost holy. Something inside Arthur broke. The fear, the grief, the years of quiet desperation, it all burned away, leaving only a white-hot, singular rage. He forgot the plan. He grabbed an old, rusty pitchfork and scrambled down the ladder, a wild cry tearing from his own throat, ready to charge into a fight he could not possibly survive. It was Ingrid who saved them all. Seeing her sister hit, seeing Arthur's suicidal charge, her eyes went from stone to fire. "Freya, now!" she roared. From behind the corral, Freya swung a heavy sledgehammer down onto the tripwire mechanism Arthur had built. The world dissolved into a deafening, gut-punching roar. His trap. It wasn't a massive fireball, but a concussive blast of sound and force. The buried charges erupted, not killing but shattering. The rock wall of the narrow pass groaned and collapsed, sending an avalanche of stone and dirt onto the trail. The horses screamed their primal terror, overriding all training. They bucked, reared, and bolted, throwing riders and trampling Thorn's organized assault into a panicked, screaming mob. Chaos reigned. In the dust and confusion, the sisters pressed their advantage. They were no longer defending. They were hunting. Thorn was thrown from his horse, his leg twisted beneath him. He looked up from the dirt, his reign of terror over, to see the 3 giant women and the small, furious man walking toward him through the settling dust. He was no longer a baron. He was just a man who had made a fatal mistake. He had mistaken their sanctuary for a prize and its guardians for monsters. The battle was over. Arthur rushed to Helga's side as she leaned against the cabin wall, her face pale, her hand clamped tight over her bleeding shoulder. The rage was gone, now replaced by a tremor in his hands he couldn't control. "You're hurt?" he whispered, his voice choked. She looked at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold fire in her eyes had softened, replaced by a raw, staggering vulnerability. She had taken a bullet for him. He reached out his small, scholar's hands, pressing against her wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Their eyes met over his trembling fingers, and in the ringing silence of the aftermath, a new unspoken truth passed between them. The war for the farm was won. The battle for what came next had just begun. The silence that fell after the battle was heavier than the roar that preceded it. It was a silence filled with the scent of spent gunpowder, the low groans of the wounded, and the profound ringing finality of victory. Arthur knelt beside Helga, his mind a frantic scramble of battlefield memories he had long tried to bury. He had seen wounds like this before in the blood-soaked fields of Shiloh. Wounds that could fester, that could steal a life long after the bullet had found its home. Water, he commanded, his voice raw, unfamiliar to his own ears. It was not the voice of a scholar, but of a man who had seen the cost of inaction. Boil it, and bring the cleanest cloth you can find, and whiskey. All of it. Freya, her face a pale mask of terror, immediately scrambled to obey. Ingrid, however, stood like a statue carved from vengeance, her gaze fixed on the bound form of Bartholomew Thorn. Her blacksmith's hammer was still in her hand, its head stained with the grim realities of the fight. "They are not worth the water," she snarled, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "She is Arthur," shot back, his eyes locked on Helga's pale face. He looked at Ingrid, meeting her fiery gaze without flinching. "We won. Don't let him turn us into him, not now." For a long, tense moment, Ingrid's fury warred with his reason. Then her shoulders slumped slightly. She dropped the hammer with a heavy thud and went to help her sister. The hours that followed were an intimate, terrifying ritual. Arthur, the man of soft hands and quiet books, became a makeshift surgeon. He poured the raw whiskey over the wound, ignoring Helga's sharp guttural cry of pain, his own heart clenching in sympathy. With Freya's help, he cleaned the wound as best he could, his fingers once so skilled with a pen now learning the grim geography of torn flesh and muscle. Helga never cried out again. She lay on the cabin's main table, her teeth gritted, her eyes closed, her breathing a shallow rhythm in the quiet room. But as Arthur worked, her free hand found his, her powerful fingers wrapping around his with a surprising gentleness. It was not a plea for comfort. It was an anchor, a silent, profound transfer of trust. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of their battle, he was no longer an outsider. He was hers. They were his. The next day, a council was held over the fate of Thorn and his surviving men. They were a pathetic sight, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw, sniveling fear of men who had lost everything. "We should leave them for the coyotes," Ingrid stated, her voice flat. Arthur shook his head. He had spent the night watching over Helga, and in the quiet hours a different kind of plan had formed. Justice, not vengeance. "No," he said. His poison was a lie. "Our cure will be the truth." He spent an hour with Thorn, using not a weapon, but the cold, sharp edge of the man's own crimes. With the captured ledger and the original deed spread before him, Arthur dictated a confession. He detailed the plot, the poisoned creek, the fire, the names of the men on the payroll. At first Thorn spat and cursed, but under Arthur's relentless logical assault and the silent, terrifying presence of Ingrid standing in the doorway, he broke. He signed the confession with a shaking hand. They didn't kill him. They did something far crueler. They tied him along with his 2 chief lieutenants onto their own horses facing backward. They hung the signed confession around Thorn's neck in an oilskin pouch and pinned a copy of the incriminating ledger page to his chest. "The next town is 2 days' ride that way," Arthur said, pointing south. "There's a federal marshal there. I imagine he'll be very interested in your story." He slapped the rump of Thorn's horse, sending the humiliated men on a slow, ignominious journey toward the justice they had so long evaded. The weeks that followed were a time of healing. The farm bore the scars of their war, the blackened earth of the firebreak, the collapsed rock in the pass, the splintered wood of the cabin walls. But slowly, painstakingly, they rebuilt. It was a new kind of work. Arthur, with his mind for planning, directed the repairs. The sisters, with their incredible strength, provided the labor. He was no longer a ghost in their world. He was its architect. He designed a more clever irrigation system from the now clean creek. He showed them how to reinforce the cabin's foundation. They, in turn, showed him the rhythms of the land. Freya taught him which roots were for healing and which were for sustenance. Ingrid taught him how to read the clouds to feel the coming rain in the air. Helga healed slowly. For the first time, Arthur saw the vulnerability beneath her iron exterior. He would read to her in the evenings from his book of poems, his quiet voice a balm in the rustic cabin. She never said she liked it, but she never told him to stop. Her arm remained in a sling, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for his life, a price he now spent every day trying to repay. He no longer slept in the barn. A small room in the back of the cabin had been cleared for him. The silence he had once craved was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of a living house, the murmur of the sisters' voices in their native Norwegian, the crackle of the hearth, the soft thud of Freya's loom. He found that the silence he had been searching for wasn't an absence of noise, but an absence of fear. His ghosts had grown quiet here. They had not been banished by solitude, but soothed by company. One cool evening, a month after the battle, he sat on the rebuilt porch watching the stars prick the vast velvet darkness. The air was clean, the land was quiet. Helga came and sat beside him in a large rocking chair they had salvaged. Her arm was out of the sling now, her shoulders still stiff but strong. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time. "The wound," she said finally, her voice low, "it does not hurt any more." "I'm glad," he replied softly. She turned to look at him, her face softened by the moonlight. "You are a good man, Arthur. Better than this land deserves. This land gave me a home," he said, looking not at the horizon, but at her, when I thought I had none left. She reached out her large warm hand, covering his. It was a gesture of profound, startling intimacy. "Yes," she whispered. "It did." The next day they finished the last of the major repairs, a new solid oak door for the front of the cabin. It was a symbolic act, the closing of a chapter of violence and fear. That evening, as Arthur prepared to head to his small back room, Helga stopped him. Ingrid and Freya stood behind her, their faces holding a warm, welcoming light. The entire cabin felt different, settled, complete, whole. "The house is finished," Arthur Helga said, her voice soft, devoid of its old, hard edges. "There is a proper room for you now, the one at the top of the stairs. The best one." He looked at her, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. She gave him a small, genuine smile, a sight more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever seen. "It's time you came inside for good," she said. "It's time you slept with us." He stepped over the threshold, leaving the cold memories of the past outside in the dark. The door closed behind him, not on a kingdom of dust and ghosts, but on the loud, beautiful, chaotic, and undeniable warmth of a family. He was at long last home.